I'm going to concentrate on a couple of challenges that I see coming out of what we've heard already and coming out of the video. I don't think it'll be a surprise if I say that, working for the European Anti-Poverty Network, that I believe the answer to the question of whether we should engage with political change is definitely yes, because we are an organisation set up to support people working against poverty on a day-to-day basis in understanding and influencing and engaging with policy making at Irish and European level. And that's primarily about people working as community activists on the ground, finding the space to deal with the bigger issues that affect our lives. And it's something that I suppose motivated me and particularly concentrated my minds from experience in the 1980s when I had a chance to work in Nicaragua with the Sandinista government. And looking at the situation there, we saw a civil society which was dynamic in a way that we could only dream about in this country. A very strong women's movement, a very strong cooperative movement, a very strong equality movement, very strong literacy movements, popular health campaigns, a very vibrant democracy with over 45 parties competing at every level for power, many of them better funded than the government parties. And the reason they lost and the reason why most of the progress they made during that time was overturned, turned back, destroyed, and people's lives now are in many ways worse than they were a couple of decades ago, was not because of any mistakes they made as society on the ground, but because they lost the bigger battles, because bigger international global forces, people who had a vested interest in democracy not working in Nicaragua, whether they were large corporations with investments, whether they were rich people who felt they'd lost out on land holdings, whether they were American government worried about its strategic position in the region, whatever, that those forces, in a sense, turned the tide back. So if we're going to achieve the sort of change we want to achieve, we need to get it right on the ground, we need to get it right at national level, but increasingly we need to get it right at global level, and that's what I want to reflect mostly on today. Hilary Mantel, the novelist who has written a lot of historical novels, people may know Wolf Hall or A Place of Greater Safety, gave a Reith lecture a few days ago, and she was asked at the end why she's interested in history. And she said, a lot of the things we say about history are very simplistic. You can't necessarily learn direct lessons from one situation to another. But the one thing we learn from history is that change always happens. Change isn't just possible, change is inevitable. And the important question is not about whether we can create change or whether we can stop change, but whether the type of values we want to put in can affect change. And a lot of the thinking we have about the future, and I think it's reflected very much in the video we've just watched, can be very pessimistic, and I think can be too pessimistic. If you ask anyone, particularly young people, but anyone nowadays, what you would expect to see in a futuristic film, what you'd expect to see is a world destroyed by climate change, by nuclear war, by aliens or zombies or whatever it is. What you expect to see is feudal gangs with motorbike escorts, creating new forms of slavery, creating new forms of, particularly for women or for other vulnerable groups in the society. And if you were to ask me, when I first became involved in activism, what I saw in the future, I would probably not have thought about the eradication of smallpox, serious impact and possible eradication of malaria, people surviving in childhood and in childbirth in a way that we couldn't have imagined 40 years ago, people's life expectancy improving, building health systems across the world. The idea even that in theory, if not in practice, most countries are now committed to some form of democracy and human rights. We wouldn't have built on the optimism, we would have built on the pessimism. And this is what we're constantly being fed all of the time, and I think it's something that we ourselves contribute to. And certainly in my day job, most of the time, I don't think about the positives, I think about the negatives. I think about the impact of austerity policies in the last 10 years on our members and the people we work with. I think about the ways in which services have been decimated, which make people's lives, push people's lives right over the edge, people who are already on the margin. We think about the way in which conditions at work have been undermined and made worse over the last number of years. We think about the cutbacks to the sort of organizations which allow people to organize in their own community to change their own lives. But we forget that change is possible and that change can also be positive. And I think one of the things we need to remember is that when we look at things like Trump and Brexit, And when we look at the rise of racism, the rise of extreme nationalism across the world, most of that is not driven by young people. Most of that is not driven by the social media generation. It's people my age and older who voted for Trump. It's not the young people. It's people my age and older who voted for Brexit, who voted for Le Pen. And I think we need to be conscious of the fact that while young people, the key issue for young people is not that they are flocking to the far right, that they're flocking to nationalist or racist solutions. It's not that they are trying to rebuild some of the discrimination that we took for granted 40 years ago that is now in some ways has changed, but it's that they are not politically mobilized, and that the older generation who are feeling the uncertainty in different ways are the people who are driving that change. So I think sometimes we need to remember when we talk about social media bubbles and so on, it's not the social media generation largely which is driving the revival of the far right. It's very much the Daily Mail generation, the Sunday Independent generation, or and that's not meant to insult particular journalists who may be here writing about it, but it's the people who rely on traditional one-way means of communication. So the sort of challenges I think we need to think about, I think a lot of the challenges we're dealing with, and I think it's come out already, are actually the challenges of linking the global with the local. The way people in the Green Movement particularly talked in the past about thinking globally and acting locally. I think now we need to think about how we're going to think globally, locally, and act locally, regionally, nationally, European level, and globally, because you cannot no longer separate those. Most of the things that are driving change in Ireland, the austerity policies of the last number of years, were driven very much by the sort of things that Siobhan particularly talked about, the concentration of power in certain financial houses, concentration of power in certain hands, the fact that large corporations, individuals, as Mary talked about, are escaping, if you like, from the sort of national jurisdictions which have been painstakingly built up over the last 150 years, the fact that a lot of the sort of decisions that we used to expect from our politicians at national level can no longer be affected at national level because global power is so concentrated. So some of the challenges are, firstly, can we actually build some form of democracy at global level? Because if we can't build some sort of democracy at global level, we'll never do it at national level or local level anymore, because the real centres of power are moving to tax havens, they're moving to virtual spaces, they're moving out of the control of national governments, and the type of room for manoeuvre of national governments is getting less and less, and there are very good reasons why people are losing faith in democratic structures, and it's not, as the media might like to tell us, just about corrupt politicians or people losing, or about the political class losing connections with the ground. I don't think it's really about that at all. It's about the fact that politicians cannot actually do the things that we expect them to do, and the new forms of democracy, participatory democracy we've all been talking about for decades, have not really yet created an alternative. There's lots of seeds of hope there, and I think within the community sector and within the voluntary sector, there are lots of seeds of hope, but we haven't created ways in which we can do democracy and ways in which we can create serious solidarity at global level strong enough to challenge the type of concentration of power and resources that we're seeing at global level. A second challenge, which also comes from globalization, is about understanding and welcoming diversity. A lot of what we saw in the video was actually, it was partly about reactions to economic and social instability, but a lot of that was about people turning to nationalist solutions. And as a few people have said, they're not the only solutions out there, they never have been, but when you don't see any prospect of your country, your trade union, the organizations you're part of, really creating a better life for you, or you creating a better life through those institutions, people will always turn to nationalism. It's happened many times before, it's happened in the 30s, it's happening now, and it's happened many times in other places. It's not just happening in Europe and America, it's happening in India, it's happening in China, it's happening all over. The growth of forms of ethnic nationalism where people will blame people who are different for their problems. So an enormous challenge for our sector is actually welcoming the value of ethnic diversity in terms of migration, but also looking into our own past. The fact that as a country which thinks of itself as largely homogenous, largely very similar, we've never come to terms with the conflict between the settled community and travellers, for example, that racism in a country which had very little racial diversity, racism is very deeply embedded in our country, even though, as James Joyce said back 100 years ago, we never had anti-Semitism in Ireland because we never let the Jews in. The same is true largely of international migration. But in a globalised world, we need to learn how to welcome, work with difference and diversity. We need to revive the importance of different ways of public and communal ways of dealing with problems. That's about the public sector, because most of the changes I talked about earlier, disease control, the improvement of people's standard of living worldwide, was driven by a combination of the public sector and community activism. We need to think how that combination can be developed, but also how it can be globalized. We need to put economic justice back on the agenda. The reason why the Trumps and the Brexit have won is because people have moved the focus from welfare state, from rights at work, from quality services to towards nationalism and towards conflict and difference. We need to get those values back into the centre of our public debate. And this is all very complex, it's very difficult, and that's one of the reasons why we as a community sector and we as a voluntary sector need to think about it, because the one thing we're really good at in the community sector is handling complexity and difference and messiness, creating alliances around particular issues which are non-traditional alliances, working with some people, for example, on disease eradication programs, when those same people are lobbying against action against tax havens, which we might want to take on in other areas, lobbying with some people around economic issues and others around diversity issues, working with a whole lot of different people in different ways, in complex ways that are not particularly well structured, but where we can try to think strategically. I think it's one of the things that we're strong at and one of the things where we can make a serious contribution. And finally, just to say, I think the role of the European Union needs to be emphasized in all of this. It is one of the few spaces where, on the one hand, it shows some of the worst things about globalization. It models some of the worst things in terms of hardwiring fiscal austerity into its system and hardwiring free trade without balancing that with strong social and democratic structures. On the other hand, it's one of the few international agreements in the world that has a serious commitment to building human rights into its structures, to direct democracy through the European Parliament and through other mechanisms in its structures, and has a serious commitment in the past, and to a certain extent in the present, in potential at least, to build a more democratic structure and to model the sort of democratic solidarity we need to build in a broader scale across the world and bring right back into our local communities at home as well.